We talk about agendas and resolutions. It's unusual to do this by a virtual format since we're so used to doing things live and in person, but everyone's trying to make do with what we've got. I think we have a process in which you can send in questions. So if you have questions, just send those in as we go. We'll try to address as many of those as we can. Today, we're going to cover primarily a sample agenda. Some of you have heard me talk about agendas and meetings before. I've been doing this for a while. I like to talk about how we can make our meetings better and our agendas better. And I think the key to having a better meeting is starting with a good agenda. Having been to about 200 cities around the state, including some recently, including one as recently as last night, I can tell you we still have work to do to get better at what we do, because we should be a little more efficient, and that really is the goal. I am convinced that if we look at what cities have done around the state, we all have evolved in different ways to do things the way that we just do them. And I say that from seeing some very good habits and practices in some cities that seem like the way things were done 20 or 30 years ago. So I think we want to start with just a sample agenda. Some of you may have attended an OMMS training session about 1.5 years ago. And at that session, we worked on and produced a sample agenda that is on the OKMMS website. And if we can move ahead in the slides, can I do that? No. Aubrey's going to help me with the technology. Then we will do that. First, hopefully know where the Open Meeting Act is. If you want to go to oscn.net, you can get to the Open Meeting Act by going to Title 25, Sections 301 through 314. I haven't reprinted those here, but that's where you can find it. So feel free to have that handy, because you'll need it, and we always do. The idea of having a sample agenda was real simple. In the history of Oklahoma, I'm not aware that there has been one that's been created for us to have as our sample. So we wanted to have something that would be available for cities to look at. Again, it's on the website, and really is just a format of something you could look at to make it easier and have something to go by. This one just starts with the basic information. When we had our conference, we got input from a number of different people. We started with a basic one, and we came to this conclusion as a sample. A call to order and list the time. And a part of the reason to do it this way is to try to look at practices that will make it as easy as possible for the clerk to keep minutes and to keep up with what's going on, because I know how difficult that can be when you have 5 or more council members or trustees who may be talking at the same time, who may be in a habit of having bad habits and how they behave at meetings. So we wanted to make it as easy as possible. It is common to list the council members' names. I know that in different places there are different habits about how roll is called. Some places it's by first name, some places it's are all here. So there's a wide variety. And again, the sample is not intended to tell you that you're doing it wrong. It is intended to give you a guide so that if you want to take parts of it and make yours better, hopefully it helps to do that. Listing the names on the agenda makes it easy for roll call, and it makes it easier for the clerk in doing their job, and it makes it easier to keep up with things. So that is the purpose in doing it that way. On the next page, you'll see Pledge of Allegiance. I think almost every city council meeting has that, not all, but most. It's not required, it's up to each individual city. And then number 4, we see in some places a consent agenda. And I've been in a meeting recently in which there was not a consent agenda. And I wanted to talk a little bit about it so that everyone would know why we have it and what we do with it. The basic requirement or allowance is that we can list on consent anything that may be routine And then everything listed under consent can be approved by one motion. And that makes it easier for everyone involved in the process to take a lot of different action in one motion. This one only has 3 things listed. I've been in meetings in which the consent agenda may be 25 or more items. And the restriction is it needs to be something that is considered routine. So as long as you meet that requirement, there's nothing wrong with including it this way and listing it as a consent agenda item. I've also recently been in a meeting in which the mayor in a city read every consent agenda item, A through Z. And I thought that kind of defeated the purpose of efficiency by reading each of them in the meeting before the council voted on it. And I don't think that's required at all. The posting requirement under the Open Meeting Act meets the requirement of giving notice to the public. So there is not a requirement to read each and every consent agenda item prior to the vote. And I think the most common practice is that those are not read. Again, everything that's routine can be included on consent. If council members have questions about the routine items, they can ask those in advance, should be encouraged to ask those in advance. If you know an item will generate a lot of discussion or controversy, that by itself should tell you it probably shouldn't be on consent. It's probably not routine. We should never think of this as a way to hide something we want to do or to get something through just because we can put it on consent and get it out of the way. It is not unusual to include budget amendments if they're routine, payment of claims, insurance renewals, routine purchases. All of those things can be on consent. So, and again, if each item is reviewed, discussed, and voted on separately, it defeats the purpose of having a consent agenda. I've been in a meeting also in which the council voted on every single agenda item separately, even though it was listed as a consent listing. So again, the whole purpose of it is to make us more efficient, to make your job easier in keeping up with the minutes, and to show that all of these things that are routine can be approved by one motion. We have a question whether claims can go on it, and the answer is yes. I think that raises a couple of questions. We'll talk a little bit about spending authority as a part of this, and want to address this. I know most cities have some spending authority that's set by resolution or ordinance or charter. We have as a habit in Sand Springs, and this is one of the things we changed. They used to have the habit of having every claim on the agenda to be approved by council. Many of those claims, or most of those claims, had already been paid and were within the spending authority of the city manager. So there was no point in having it on the agenda to be voted on. We now just provide a copy of the claims that have been paid. So it is common to include the claims list or claims as a part of the consent agenda, so there's nothing wrong with that. But I would challenge you to review whether they need to be there at all, because as an attorney, I've always been concerned, what do we do if we've already paid a claim and then the city council votes no? Why are we asking them to vote on something that may have already been paid, may have already been approved within the authority of someone who had the authority to approve it? And then we're going to invite a dispute or a disagreement about what to do on this claim by now having a vote that maybe we shouldn't pay it. And to me, that doesn't make sense. If the manager or town administrator or department head has spending authority, I don't know of any reason it needs to go back on the agenda unless your charter requires it back on the agenda for the council to approve it. Otherwise, sometimes we hear the criticism, well, that's the way our council has always done it, and they want that information. Maybe they do. They can still get the information. Question is whether they should vote on it if they're not required to vote on it. So I would encourage you to understand, review and understand what your spending authority is so that you can see what goes on the agenda. And that really ties into the bigger picture of the most common thing I see around the state and going to a lot of different cities And that is that we put routine administrative things on the agenda. And those routine administrative things, and I'll give you a great example. I've seen this year, purchasing a lawnmower for our city or purchasing a vehicle. Both of those I've seen this year, in which the purchase is within the manager's spending authority already. And I've seen those show up on agendas, and the council spend a lot of time debating which lawnmower to buy or which vehicle to buy because they're comfortable discussing those things. And the end result of doing that is they spend a lot of time on routine administrative things and not much time on the important work of figuring out what the long-range goals of the city should be. And that really is what they get elected to do. When we really step back and look at what their job is to figure out, as elected officials, the direction they want for their city or town. It is not to figure out which lawnmower to buy. And I know in the smaller towns, there's no spending authority, and those are trustee decisions by the Board of Trustees, and that's fine. But I've seen this in some of the bigger cities, and that's something we need to work to avoid. Item 5 on the sample agenda is a draft resolution. This gives you an idea of what the agenda would look like. We're going to talk about that resolution or a similar resolution in detail. And our topic today is agendas and resolutions and ordinances and really how to be more efficient and better at what we do, because it's important to have good meetings. It's one of the most important things we can do to help our city, both in image and every way you can think of. The elected officials need to enjoy their service more, and if we're more efficient in what we do, they will enjoy it more. Our city employees need to enjoy working for our city more, and they will if we're more efficient in what we do. So this resolution, I have mentioned before the training, and today we're going to go over some detail of one, and it will be available to you to look at, to get a copy of. But the idea was when we first did this, and this is not something where I should take credit for it, it is a collaborative process in Sand Springs in which we have great department heads who always have creative ideas of how we can do things. This is one where the thought came up, why can't we by resolution approve a number of different things so that we don't have to come back to council with routine approvals that may slow down a project. And this sample, the one we're going to look at, is a little bit different, but this is a sample agenda for building a building, building a community center. And it authorizes bidding, authorizes the acceptance of bid if within budget, authorizes the execution of the contracts, and authorizes all payments. We actually did one of these resolutions in Sand Springs for a $10 million project that did not need to come back on the agenda for additional council approval, only to come back to council for updates, project updates, and to let them know where it was as it was going. And if you think about that, look at how much more efficient it is in paying the contractor, how much more efficient it is for the city engineer and those working on it to get the project built. All of those things become a benefit for us. So that's how this resolution evolved. And you're going to see at the sample we look at in a minute, we've even beyond doing a $10 million project with one, we've done lots of other things to expand how those are done. So we'll talk a little more about that one, but that's used on the sample agenda as an example of how we make our agendas more efficient with the sample agenda so that we can get through our meetings more quickly. Again, they're business meetings, so we're there to do the business of the city. Financial reports are commonly included on agendas, so that's included on the sample. It's not unusual to have a correspondence section with an update of what the regular monthly bills are, and that ties into the question about claims. It's not unusual to report it this way so that council gets all the information even though they don't vote on the claims. And then it's also in the sample a city manager or mayor or town administrator or council members report so they can give an update. Obviously you can't take action on these, but it's a chance to give an update on things that are going on around the city so that there's a little bit of flexibility as to what can be reported on. Sample has the sample for executive session, and I wanted to list all of the 5 different options because those are the only 5 options. So if you need to have an executive session or are going to have an executive session, it's going to fit one of these categories. We're required and should list the topic of which of these options it fits in, and also list the statute that authorizes the executive session. For number 1, you'll see we have an economic development option, and we try to list enough detail, as much detail as we can. Economic development discussions can be kept confidential if there's a request for it to be kept confidential by an end user. So we try to list what it is in more specific terms. For example, this sample tells which development it is in. Number 2 is city manager. City is the evaluation of the city manager and which section allows that. Employment matters. In those towns that review employees, you can have an executive session to review specific employees. There is not an option of just a general workforce evaluation. I've had that question come up. And what about towns that have 2 or 3 employees total? You may be able to justify it in some place like that if it's a review of those 2 or 3 total employees of the town. That's a little bit different than a city with 200 employees, because in a city of 200 employees, you wouldn't get away with that by saying we're going to have a general personnel evaluation in executive session. That just would not be specific enough. It is okay to list, for example, if the executive session is about the police chief, to list police chief and not the name of the person. I don't think that's required, but identifying it by a position if it's a single person that's in that position. Number 3, those cities with collective bargaining issues have the right to have an executive session to discuss collective bargaining. Option 4 is purchase or the appraisal or purchase of real property. So you notice it doesn't say sale of real property. It is very specific. It's appraisal or purchase. So selling property is treated differently and not allowed. So keep that in mind. And then number 5 is confidential communications between city council and city attorney concerning investigations, claims, or other things. And it should identify what the claim is. If it's a pending lawsuit, I want to list the names of the parties in the lawsuit. There may be a time in which it's a claim and you've got to be a little more careful. You can't disclose enough detail or as much detail as we would like. And there may be circumstances where you have some limitations, and those just individually need to be reviewed. Oh, question is security or emergency plan. I believe there is a separate place where certain security and national security type issues can be handled in executive session. That's pretty rare that comes up. So I would have to look at the statute and see, but I believe there's some authority to do that if it's a true security issue. Next item after the executive session is to show the council may consider and take any action deemed appropriate as a result of the executive session. If you already have drafted, and let me give you a good example. If, for example, you're discussing the purchase of real property and you already have drafted the resolution that's going to authorize that purchase, or a real estate contract that's going to authorize that purchase, and you're going to be recommending that purchase contract be approved when you come out of executive session, I would want more detail than just what's in item B. I would say may consider and take action deemed appropriate as a result of the executive session, including the possible approval of a real estate purchase agreement. So I would try to identify if there's a known expected action that's being recommended, I would identify it with more detail. One thing we always need to keep in mind with the Open Meeting Act is that it is setting a minimal standard. Cities that get in trouble with it are those who try to do the least they can to comply. We should always have the attitude, we're going to try to go above and beyond and give more information. We're going to go above and beyond in complying. Some of you have probably heard me tell the story of working with a city clerk 30 years ago who had an agenda ready on a Thursday, and I asked her if it had been posted yet, and she said, no, my deadline is 5 o'clock Friday. I will post it at 5 o'clock Friday. I don't care if it's ready on Thursday, because I only do the minimal amount required. Well, we changed that policy because that's not the right way to do business. If you have it ready early, you should post it early. It can be amended and within restrictions, but we should never have the attitude we're only going to do the minimal amount required, because we really want to create a history of going above and beyond complying, because that's what we should be doing. We want to give the public more notice than what's required. We want to have a habit and a history and an attitude of doing it better than what's required of us, instead of just meeting the minimal standard. Number 10 on the sample agenda is adjournment, and a vote to adjourn is not required. The mayor or chairperson is authorized to adjourn the meeting, and I mentioned I was in a meeting last night and they had a motion to adjourn and a vote. They created more work for their clerk that was unnecessary. We're going to work on changing it and over time breaking that habit, but it is not required. By adjourning the meeting, the mayor can say we are adjourned. I like us doing it this way because it's more efficient. And also, you probably have heard my story that I once in Manford was caught in a meeting in which there was a 3-2 vote on whether we should adjourn. Fortunately, 3 wanted to adjourn and 2 didn't. So we did, or we may have still been there. So keep that in mind. Your job becomes easier if you don't have to keep minutes. You can just note the time. The mayor adjourned the meeting at whatever time it was. And then on the sample, it's showing when it was posted and signed by the clerk as being posted. So that's the sample agenda. I hope it helps some of you. If you make it better, let us know. And again, it is not intended to say anyone is doing it wrong. It is intended to give you a sample of a different way to do it, maybe. And all with the idea that I know that agendas have evolved 500 different ways at 500 different cities around the state. And I think it helps us to have some sample to go back to as a starting point. Okay, a couple of questions. Good question. Does the agenda have to be signed? I think in the questions and answers, I said questions or answers or guesses. My guess is yes, but that's just a guess. I would assume so. It should be. It documents when it was posted. So city clerk or someone else, whether it's the clerk. I think I've seen them signed by the mayor, but I think the purpose in doing that is to document when it was posted. Okay. When you come, the question is, when you come out of executive session, do you have to announce what the topic was? The agenda already says what the topic is. I don't think there's a requirement to do anything above and beyond that. We're going to talk about minutes of the executive session and review that, but there's no announcement requirement in the Open Meeting Act for any of the agenda items, and there's nothing for the executive session. If there's action to be taken from the executive session, it has to be taken in the public meeting. Several meeting suggestions I want to go through that tie into that sample agenda. So let's go over those real quick. And again, if you have questions, feel free to send them in. We'll try to get an answer or a guess on each of those. Minutes are commonly signed because, again, it documents who has prepared those. Okay, so meeting suggestion number 1, I still see some places a listing for new business or old business. The Open Meeting Act doesn't recognize the term old business. So I think that's just something that we out of habit have used in some places. It's not defined for agenda purposes. So that's why you don't see it on the sample. New business does have a specific meaning within the Open Meeting Act. So new business is something that arose so late that it could not have been included on the agenda. And and if you think about that, if you're doing a special meeting, there's no place to have new business. So new business is not allowed on special meeting agendas. And I still see some places where just out of habit, it's included. It shouldn't be. So new business is something that arose too late to make it to the agenda. And with our posting requirements, that's going to be very limited in scope. So most places we should very rarely have new business. So, or new business that requires a vote. It can happen, it does happen some places, but it should be a rare occurrence. Number two, I'll mention just because it's an interesting issue that comes up someplace. The sample agenda does not include a council prayer or prayer led by anyone at the meeting. Each of you should consult with your city attorney and see. We didn't want to take a position one way or the other. I think it's about 50-50 around the state as to whether cities have a prayer on their agenda. And that really is up to each city. There are a number of constitutional restrictions and challenges. I've been through one of those challenges from the National Atheist Association, who challenged the city prayer. So I am convinced it is legal if done correctly. So, but we're not taking a position that you should or shouldn't in the sample agenda. Each city needs to answer that. Each city needs to confer with their city attorney. Part of that is answered by the past practice and past history of your city, and historically how things have been done. So they're complicated issues. I think I mentioned before, it's not necessary, number three, to vote to adjourn, just adjourn the meeting. Life simpler in keeping minutes by saying the meeting was adjourned at this time. Number four is a good question of 4A especially, and we probably have not provided enough training or talked about that enough. It's easier in the bigger cities. It's difficult sometimes in the small towns, but who controls the agenda? Who has the right to put something on it? What are the restrictions? How do we get there? And I can give you some extreme examples of some of the things I've seen in the last couple of years. So let's start with the easy one. Usually in a city manager city, the city manager has control of the agenda. Usually in a town administrator city, the town administrator has control, as in determining what goes on the agenda, what's appropriate for the agenda. And you'll see in 4C, it is not up to the public to set the agenda. I still see this in some places in which someone will include an agenda item because Joe called and requested it. Well, we have the right to decide what's going to be on the agenda of our business meeting. The Open Meeting Act does not say the public has the right to include anything and everything on the agenda. So I think the common practice, the best practice, is for that to be determined by management in a city manager, town administrator city, obviously with the elected officials having the ability to have input and to dictate that there can be an agenda item. I think it is horrible practice for us to say the elected officials cannot put something on the agenda. They may need training as to what's appropriate. They may need to talk to someone who discourages something inappropriate, but generally the elected officials should have the ability to put something on the agenda. The more difficult places are the smaller towns, and what is the role of the clerk? And this is really where I think we need to spend some time at some point. Probably it'd be good to have an entire session on just this issue in the elected town clerk form of government. Town trustee form in which the city clerk or town clerk is elected, who controls the agenda and who has a right to decide what goes on it. I have heard in the last couple of years a couple of areas in which there's some disagreement about that topic. There have been some who take the position the city clerk is elected to do that and exclusively has the authority to do that, and exclusively has the authority to decide what goes on the agenda. I believe that power belongs to the elected officials, and that by resolution, they can dictate an agenda policy, and probably should. Hopefully that doesn't become necessary. But I think that's something we should look at, and probably something we should work on for future, of creating some guidance on what is appropriate to go on the agenda and who decides that. And it really is an area that needs some work. Routine administrative things that can be accomplished by staff within their spending authority should not be on the agenda. As I mentioned, the public does not set the agenda. We do have in some cities, and I think it's a very good process, a public right to request something on the agenda, and that's reviewed by management, and if they think it's appropriate, they can include it on the agenda, but management has veto power. And the problem with allowing the public to have complete control is there's no telling what you may get. You may want the public who wants to say bad things about a specific employee of the city. You may have the public who wants to talk about things that are not the city council's business. I once had a citizen request that we include an agenda item to discuss the high school drug testing policy. As you can imagine, we refused to do that because the city had nothing to do with the high school drug testing policy. This was a parent who was upset that little Johnny was not being treated fairly in high school because of a failed drug test. Well, the city's not going to get involved, and the city's not going to fix that. And somebody needs to be the one who says to that citizen, sorry, we're not putting that on the agenda. If you don't like it, go elsewhere. And that's what happened. And then 4D is as I mentioned before, have an appropriate spending authority so that you avoid having routine things on the agenda. That is difficult, especially in the smaller towns. I commonly get the question of what is the appropriate spending authority, and commonly have the answer, it depends. It varies tremendously. There are some charter restrictions in some cities that are very low. A couple of years ago, I had an elected official approach me and before a city council training and asked that I address the outrageous spending authority in their city because they thought it was too high. And they told me their spending authority was $1,500 for the mayor, and a strong mayor form of government. And of course I laughed and said, well, I represent a town that's a third that size who has a $50,000 spending authority for a town administrator. So 1,500 seemed low to me. So I think that's something that just needs to be reviewed regularly, and it needs to be an appropriate level. And it really becomes a discussion with the elected officials about the extent to which they want to be involved in routine daily operations. And it gets back to that question of why did they get elected? Hopefully to determine long-range policy for the city and not daily routine operations. And I know that's difficult in some places. The agenda item should provide enough information so the public is reasonably informed of what action may be taken. I've included the statutory requirements that basically says that, and a court case that says the agenda must be worded in plain language, directly stating the purpose. The language used should be simple, direct, and comprehensible to a person of ordinary intelligence. We hope we try to accomplish that. I think if there's anything I've seen in the last few years, it's not having enough information. For example, I saw an agenda item that said simply sidewalks. I don't think that told the public what might be discussed about sidewalks. I've seen agenda items that are extremely vague like that. They may say tree trimming. And again, that's not enough detail to tell the public what you're likely to do. So some work needs to be done on that. And I think if you go back to the sample, it helps get there. I believe on our sample at the very beginning, we include the listing, and if we didn't, we should, of the attendance of the members. And I put this in just as a reminder. This is just one of those issues that comes up regularly. I don't think we did, but it is common to list after each council member's name what their attendance record has been. And I think that's a good suggestion and a good way to do things, because the statute is pretty brutal, and I've had to deal with it a number of times in which a council member misses more than half the meetings in a 4-month period, consecutive 4 months, if they miss more than half the meetings, by statute, they forfeit their position. It is not a discretionary decision. I think most would say it goes on the agenda to recognize the seat is vacant. The person could be reappointed, but we should be trying to serve our elected officials by making sure they are aware of what the rules are and helping them avoid those unintended consequences if they just happen to miss too many meetings. And this seems to happen a lot, and it seems to come up a lot, and that's why I think it's a good suggestion to try to keep up with that, and for someone with the city to be responsible for keeping up with that other than the elected official, because otherwise you're going to have to tell them after they've missed too many meetings, guess what, you're no longer invited to the party. And that's usually not a pleasant discussion. So we know this will happen again because of illness or neglect or something, so we should try to deal with it. Many of you have heard me talk about public comments. I had a question from a city manager a few days ago who called and asked, don't you have a summary that outlines why we shouldn't have public comments on our agenda? And this was from a fairly good sized city. And I said, I think so, let me look. And I found that my first summary of that, or at least the first one in Word version, was from 2005. So 15 years ago, I put together for someone, a city that I did not regularly represent, a summary of why public comments were inappropriate on an agenda. I think statistically it's still around 50-50 around the state, and if you have it, that's fine. But I have been a strong advocate that it is inappropriate to have what I call open mic night, open discussion, a free-for-all, or whatever you call it, because I haven't seen yet anything good come out of the public comment agenda topic in which we invite the public to show up and raise any and every question we can think of, stump us, that's one thing they like to do, or criticize us, another one the public likes to do, or invite us to violate the Open Meeting Act by raising a topic in which they want us to express an opinion. So each of those things are a trap for us. So I've been a strong advocate that I don't think it's good business practice to have a public comments section on the agenda. And if we encourage cities to get with it or get rid of it if they can, I know there are political difficulties in doing that in some places. But if we think about what that item does, it does not comply with the Open Meeting Act by telling the public what we're going to do. An agenda item that says sidewalks has more detail than this as far as complying with the Open Meeting Act and telling the public what we're going to talk about. So we're inviting someone to raise a topic, and our elected officials are being told you can't take action and you really can't discuss it, but you need to sit and take it and listen to the public criticism just for the fun of it. And I know there are many places in which this is just out of control. When it's out of control, it's probably a bad time to change it. But those cities who do not have public comments, I'm not aware of a single one who's made a conscious decision to go back to it. We have public hearings. We have a place for a public to talk about things that are on the agenda. But if you want to have open mic night, go down to the local bar and have fun. I don't think it's appropriate at a business meeting, because our city council meeting should be a professional business meeting, and our cities will be better run if we do that. So I say all of that, but don't go back to your city and say that crazy guy speaking last week told me we had to take off public comments, because your local paper may not react real well to that. My suggestion is you should review it, and if there's an ability to get rid of it after some discussion, I think you should consider getting rid of it. But it is not saying you have to. Again, about half the cities around the state have it, and it does make for good entertainment in some places, especially those who broadcast their meetings. So some in the public will be upset if you get rid of it. So we talked about executive sessions the limitations on it. So this is just a little more detail about it. It can't be used for general personnel discussion, as I mentioned, so I won't go over that again. Near the bottom, there is mention of a confidentiality form, and I think that's one of the better ways to deal with an issue that seems to come up a lot. How do we make sure what's talked about in the executive session stays confidential? If you go to the OKMMS website, you'll see a confidentiality form from executive session. I take credit for stealing that from OWASO because I think they were one of the first that was using it, and we should steal good ideas from other places. So it is a form that is used with every executive session, and I've had a habit of using it now for quite a while. I think it helps as a reminder to our elected officials and anyone else who may be in the executive session that what's discussed there is confidential. They actually sign a form and a one-page document that says they agree to keep it confidential. And at least it serves as a reminder as you have in the executive session. Also, I'll mention there is a requirement that you vote to enter executive session. It's not necessary to vote to reconvene the meeting. I think the mayor can simply announce when you return to the room, the executive session is over, we're now going to restart our public meeting, because by definition, you are back in public. You should note on your minutes when the executive session ended, but a separate vote to restart the meeting, by definition, you are restarting the meeting because you're back in public. So again, I think that's one of those ideas that hopefully helps make it easier to keep up with the minutes, keeps you from having to call the roll so many times and document who voted which way. Think about it for a minute. If you come out of an executive session that's in a separate room and you go back into the council chambers and you're all sitting in a public meeting with the public sitting around, why do you need to vote to say you're now back in a public meeting? You are. So I think the minutes that reflect that the meeting reconvened at a certain time or the executive session ended at a certain time is sufficient. I wanted to give you a sample of what executive session minutes look like, and this is again one I steal from Sand Springs that Janice put together, but we probably 10 years ago. Minutes. This has been probably in my many years of doing this, one of the issues that's been very difficult to get a good handle on how we should do it. What's the right answer? And if you talk to city attorneys around the state, you'll get a lot of different answers and a lot of confusion. And if you talked to me 15 years ago about it, you would have probably gotten a different answer from me. I spent a number of years in which I would personally keep notes of the executive session. I would date them and I would put them in a file that was secure. And I would think to myself, I kept the minutes of the executive session and I've got them in case anyone ever needs them. The flaw in that thinking was they were never voted on. There were no minutes of the executive session because there are no minutes unless they're officially approved by the body. So I still have a lot of notes from executive session, and those notes really to be redefined as evidence, which as an attorney, I hate to create evidence that may be used against us, but that's really all I was doing. There is a better way, and what we have here on this page is an actual minute, and I think we need to change our thinking and change our answer. Do you keep minutes of the executive session? The answer is yes, and here they are. They're going to be included with your regular minutes, and this one is one that would show after an economic development executive session, discussion was held for the purpose of conferring on what was exactly listed on the agenda, because that's what happened in the executive session. That's going to be included in the minutes, just as the other minutes, all as one group. When the full minutes are presented for the board to vote on, they're going to approve those minutes of the executive session. And the answer becomes, yes, we do have minutes of the executive session. Here they are. So I think that's the best way to approach executive session minutes. You do keep them and you include them with the regular agenda, and what is there is sufficient. So hopefully that becomes a good habit for us that avoids some confusion that probably the city attorneys have created for years. Again, the sample agenda and confidentiality form are at the website that's listed, so feel free to look at that. I think we have some other resources there that may help. Some real quick survey results. I think that number is growing. Percentage of cities who have meetings that last less than an hour. I think if we were to redo this survey, we'd find it's gotten a little bit better. But our goal, I think, should be a 1 hour meeting. And some places that would be too long because some cities have gotten to the point they have very short meetings, and that's good. They get their business done and move on. How to make our meetings more efficient, and we talked about the resolution, and I know we're getting close to our hour, so I want to spend a little bit of time on this resolution. And I mentioned before, we can include a lot of different items in a resolution that will make our job easier. Award a bid, amend the budget, authorize the mayor or manager to sign a contract, authorize the payment of funds pursuant to the contract, authorize change orders if within the budget, and require regular reports to the council. If you think about it, you may have a series of meetings on a construction project that are either special meetings or a delay in the project because you're waiting on a regular meeting agenda to either pay for something or approve a change order. And by doing a resolution like this, we avoid that. And if we can pull up the sample resolution, I want to go over one that's probably more complicated than what you'll deal with in most places. And again, this is a sample from Sand Springs, but it is a more complicated sample than most because it dealt with the May 2019 flood. And we had a number of issues in a number of different areas in which the Arkansas River flooded and a lot of different projects that needed to be worked on. So you'll see there are some whereas paragraphs that outline what the purpose of it was, and then you'll see some action items. And number one is we're amending the budget, and this one was to increase the expenditures in those amounts. Again, our city council was completely comfortable with doing this because they wanted the project finished as quickly as possible because we had a flood, we had utility systems that were closed, we had parks that were closed. So the challenge to staff was, how can we get this open as quickly as possible? How can we make the repairs as quickly as possible? So first we're going to do budget amendments, and it shows a series of those of where we're moving money, some of them substantial amounts, to be able to make repairs. And council, your elected officials will be okay with that if there's a lot of trust between the elected officials and staff. And I think that's really the point of being able to get to the point that we could do that. And so you'll know, we went through this entire process. I think every one of these has now been completed. And zero complaint by council that this was about doing it in this process, because they received regular reports of what was going on. They were, I think, overall very satisfied that they didn't have to come back and have a lot of special meetings to deal with these issues because they really wanted them fixed, and that was the goal. So you see all the budget amendments in part one. Part two, we start identifying, or paragraph two, we start identifying some specific projects that are getting approved. So an emergency contract was approved. And then if we scroll down, we see other approvals. Can you do that? Or can I? No. We see other approvals though of specific projects. Number two being an Avery Drive lift station, $334,000 project in which we reaffirm that the emergency contract was needed for system design. And then we're going to see approval of different construction components of that project and other projects as we go through the rest of them. Purchase of pumps for $50,000, purchase of a generator, hiring of a general contractor. So each of those, they found there was a sole source because it was. And then they authorized each of the purchases. We see next on number 6, another utility repair of $123,000, and again, multiple approvals within it. Number 7, we see a solid waste contract. We'd had a flood and we needed to enter into a contract to get rid of debris and flooded materials from a subdivision. Number 8, we get into parks projects. So a park had been flooded. So there's a design contract. There become purchases for supplies and labor and equipment for rebuilding different sites within the park, and a different design contract, purchasing different supplies for playground resurfacing, number of different things. Number 9, paragraph 9, you see for this project, even though the city manager's purchasing authority citywide was $25,000, for this project, the council was willing to raise it to $50,000 so that there would not be a need to come back and delay these so that they'd get finished faster. So, and then the remaining paragraphs are just a delegation of additional authority to sign the contracts and to authorize the projects to move forward. You may have charter restrictions that keep you from doing this, and you need to review those. But if you have the authority to do it this way, I think it's just one of the better ways of making your meetings more efficient and accomplishing more in a shorter amount of time that I think your elected officials, most places, will be happy with it. So feel free to look at that resolution. I know Aubrey will find a way to make that available on our website so everyone has access to it. And then she'll find a way to get me back to the PowerPoint so we can continue. Maybe. May make me go away. Now we're back to something. Our time's almost up, and it seems like we didn't have enough time to cover everything we needed to. So it may be a good idea. I don't know if there are any other questions, but if there are, it may be a good time to ask if there are any other questions you want to email in. I don't know if we can do that easily. There we go. Now we're back. Sort of. Yeah, we can manage it like that. So this next slide, the scope of what you can do is only limited by the amount of trust the elected officials have in staff. And I think that's something we just always need to keep in mind as our long-term goal. If we do our jobs well and build a good working relationship with our elected officials and have a consistency of giving them all the information they need to make good decisions and have a history of that in our city, we can build a lot of trust that will make our jobs more enjoyable and also more efficient. And the more we can do of that, the better. Reduce special meetings, reduce cost, and we do not reduce the amount of information we give to the elected officials. So it really is not an attempt to change the information. So questions, answers, guesses? Are there any other questions? Is this agenda required to be signed before posting it online? I don't know that I've ever looked at. I don't know that there is a requirement. If the type name is there for electronic posting requirement, I don't think that would be a violation of anything. I think the purpose of signing it is, again, to document when it got posted. So I don't think scanning it, rescanning it after signature is required. So I don't think that's a problem. Okay. Question is, what would fall under new business? And an example of that, let's assume you posted your agenda on a Friday and your meeting is Monday night, and at noon on Monday, you have a water line break that's going to require you to spend money that's not budgeted. And you need to make a budget amendment to deal with that emergency that has only come up Monday during the day. So that would be something that would qualify as new business. You could take action to approve something to go ahead and make that purchase or make that repair, because it's something that came up so late it could not have been included on the agenda. I think a good habit and a good practice, if you do that, would be then to reaffirm that on your next regular agenda anyway, just so that there would never be any question about whether that was appropriate or not. So I think that would be the classic one, something that is truly an emergency that comes up after the agenda is posted. So hopefully that helps. Good question. We have this come up sometimes. You have a contentious meeting and the next day everyone's lined up out the door at City Hall wanting a copy of the minutes or the local media. There are no minutes until they're voted on and approved. So I don't think there's a requirement to provide draft minutes or a time limit to say you have to have the minutes finished to produce to someone the next day or before they are voted on. So I'm not aware of any requirement to expedite minutes. It may be good business practice to say, here's a draft, here's what we think happened, depending on what your circumstances are, but I'm not aware of any requirement to provide minutes as a public document until they've been voted on and approved. I don't think they meet the requirement of a record that's available until then. When do they get voted on? Common practice is the next regular meeting. That doesn't always happen, but I think that's a good practice. Otherwise, the minutes get behind. But we should, as a regular practice, the next regular meeting. Lots of our cities now meet once a month instead of twice a month. So monthly shouldn't be too difficult to get the minutes approved at the next meeting. Anything else? I think we're out of time anyway. It looks like it's 1 o'clock. Thanks for bearing with us. I hope it's a good way to get information out to you. I would much prefer we do this in person because we get great questions. I've always been extremely impressed when I show up at the clerks conference because the quality of the questions and the diversity of the questions that are out there are always challenging and good for all of us. And I think that helps us all to learn more. I would hope that over time we find a way to get more diverse training so that we're providing something for maybe that's something specific to some of the smaller towns, because I know the issues are a little bit differently. But thanks for joining us today. Hopefully it's helpful, and hopefully we'll be able to check in soon and do some more of these.